This is Book 1 of the Mountain Warriors series, Outcast, Chapter 7. I was soon swallowed by the woods. I could barely hear the SUV drive away as the thick stand of forest acted as a muffler. Even without the leaves on the trees, the barren winter branches seemed to devour me. I was totally alone. It was an odd feeling. I was a city boy. I had only felt solitude in my own room, locked away in my privacy with constant forms of electronic entertainment controlled by my fingertips. Although I was alone in the woods, I felt no privacy. I felt eyes upon me. Were they the eyes of people, bears, zombies, or my imagination? I didn't know, but I couldn't pull the blinds, draw the curtains, or close the door on the unseen eyes around me in the forest like I could at home. The electronic noises I was used to were replaced by the chirps of birds and other things that I could not identify at the time. The high-pitched sounds of unknown animals seemed to drill in my head over the sounds of my panting and the crunching of leaves beneath my feet. Even more unnerving was the scuffling sound of paws and feet of unseen forest denizens. I purposely crashed through the brush to drown out the chirping of the animals until I heard a loud thrashing in the forest just to my right. It was so loud that in my imagination I pictured a zombie who had to have been a beefy linebacker for a top 10 college football team before he was turned into his monstrous state. This linebacker zombie sounded like he was charging straight at me. The noise couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 meters away. I couldn't see it, because whoever or whatever it was in a stand of bushes that still had leaves on in the winter. I learned later that the bush was a rhododendron tree. A miniature magnolia is the best way I can describe it. I stopped as I drew my multi-tool. I fumbled to open the blade and dropped it in the leaves. I stood still, fearing to move, fearing to breathe, as I listened for more noise from my mysterious opponent. But all I could hear was my thundering heart that was increased in volume, intensity, and beats per minute as I held my breath and held my feet still to avoid crunching the leaves. Nothing. The lack of a follow-up noise unnerved me even more. How could something that big and noisy just disappear? In an explosive, noisy burst, I blew out my breath in a gust. The combination of altitude, walking uphill, and terror played hell with holding my breath. I bent over gasping, feeling like I would never satisfy my lungs' demand for oxygen. When I finally caught my breath, I searched through the leaves at my feet as quietly as I could in order to find my multi-tool, and extended the 3-inch knife. Needless to say, it felt inadequate. Tommy should have given me something more than this pocket utensil, but the government was very restrictive on personal weapons at this time, unless you were a jackass like Don, of course. I had asked Tommy about getting a firearm, a machete, or something, but he told me my first priority was to find a band of survivors, and that they would take care of me. I then asked for advice if I ran into a zombie. He told me that the area where I was headed was pretty much clear of zombies due to the rugged nature of the mountains. But I suspected him of lying, especially after seeing some on the drive. When I pressed the issue of a zombie encounter, he simply told me to run to the nearest village. I hadn't thought to ask about what if I couldn't find a village. I had never considered the true expanse of the wilderness. All in all, I was underinformed at best and lied to at worst. I took a breath as if I was about to dive headfirst into a cold mountain spring, and finally walked into the bush, looking for whatever made the noise. I was scared, but it was even scarier not knowing what was pursuing me. I pushed my way through the branches and looked. Nothing. "Come out, you bastard!" I demanded in a harsh whisper through clenched teeth. I searched the stand of bushes, my small knife leading the way like a flashlight. I was on a hair trigger. I stepped on something round under the leaves. A head raised up about 3 feet from under the leaves, ready to strike. It was surely the gray, spade-shaped head of a giant rattlesnake. I screamed, jumped back, and fell on my butt due to the slope of the mountain. I kept screaming and kicking, trying to get away, trying to defend, trying to get to my feet, but all I could do was flail my legs. It was horrifying being on the ground with that snake. I finally calmed a bit as nothing attacked me. Maybe the snake had disappeared when I took my foot off of it. I sat there for a moment to catch my breath. I told myself that it was winter and that snakes were hibernating. That didn't quell my fears much. There were so many rumors and conspiracy theories about new monsters that had been spawned in the Forbidden Zone. After all, a giant rattlesnake that thrived in the winter was no less strange than a zombie or a vampire. Again, curiosity got the best of me. I crawled forward, then stood and looked the place over. I saw nothing but a large tree branch. I swore as I figured it all out. I simply stepped on one end of the branch. That caused the other end to rise. I looked at what I thought was the head of the snake. It was nothing but a misshapen piece of wood. It looked nothing like a rattlesnake. I cursed my overreactive imagination and tried to calm myself. However, I couldn't. I was clueless as to what had originally made that loud crashing noise. I tried to convince myself that what I heard was an overactive imagination, such as mistaking a stick for a snake. But I knew I did not imagine that thrashing through the leaves. I swore again and told myself to get my act together. I found myself mumbling to myself a lot on this hike. I kept forgetting that my recording devices were on, and that I probably sounded crazy. But it became harder to talk to myself because I was constantly out of breath, so my talking became breathless mutterings. As odd as it sounds, mumbling like a crazy man somehow kept me sane. In the week before all this, I tried to get in shape by walking and jogging a few miles every day around the flat streets of D.C. That was so naive of me. But it was too late to do anything about my lack of conditioning now. I kept trudging up the mountain. I probably climbed at a rate of less than a mile an hour. It was only 2 miles to the top of the ridgeline, and that was my goal. However, I didn't take into account the steepness or the many obstacles. So many times I had to stop, retrace my steps, and go around a rock formation, or I had to fight my way through a stand of thickets, or I had to take off my pack and squeeze through a hole that seemed just big enough for a rabbit. It was twilight when I finally reached the top of the ridgeline. It was topped with sharp rocks like a bony skeleton of a snake's vertebrae. I tried to look through the trees at the vantage point, but was disheartened to see no signs of humans. No people, no buildings, not even smoke from a campfire. Only miles of endless trees and hills. On a postcard, it would have been breathtakingly gorgeous. The expanse of the valley, the ridgeline, and the peaks. I had only seen such scenery in pictures. Pictures that did real life no justice. Now I could only offer curses to its solitude and beauty. The beautiful, warm, sunny day had turned cold and dismal. I had not noticed the change as I had trudged up the mountain. The altitude placed me right up there with the gray clouds. My hot, wet sweat suddenly felt like icy underground rivers running down the skin beneath my jacket. I started to shiver as I took off my backpack, and it immediately started to slide down the hill. As I reached for it, I slipped, fell, and slid down the hill after my pack. The downward momentum of both myself and my pack was stopped suddenly by smacking into a thick tree. I secured my backpack and looked below me. About 20 yards further down the slope was the drop-off into nothing. I eased down the hill, restraining any further fall by grasping onto saplings until I stood on a precipice. It was about 100 meters of a sheer drop down a granite cliff. I suffered a bit of vertigo as I looked down at the jagged boulders below that would savagely greet anyone unlucky enough to fall. I sighed and scrambled back to the ridgeline, looking around for a relatively flat spot to put up my tent. However, there was no such thing as flat unless you pitched a tent for a creature the size of an ant. Screw it, I muttered. The sun had set, so using the light from my headlamp, I pitched the tent on what felt like a 45-degree surface. I tried to follow the directions of the tent's package, but there was a big sag in the center of the tent, and I had a pole left over when I finished setting it up. One nice thing about the solitude is that no one is there to see your follies. I then cursed the camera vest and the cap and hoped that I could delete the whole of today without anyone ever seeing the footage. I never wanted to see it, nor did I want anyone else, particularly Tommy, viewing my awkwardness. I hadn't crossed the ridge to sleep. The rocky ridgeline felt like a wall between me and the unknown. Tomorrow I would cross. Today I wanted to sleep in the same side where my friend Tommy dropped me off. I missed my home already, and desperately. I fumbled with a camp stove for a few minutes, but between my cold, numb fingers and lack of familiarity with the gadget, I gave it up. Besides, my stomach was too queasy to eat anything. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag out of my pack and brought it into the tent with me, leaving my gear outside. The pack had food and had the potential to attract all manner of critters, including bears. I should have tied the pack up off the ground from a tree branch, but I was exhausted. I crawled into the tent, curled up, trying to find warmth. I felt like a parrot whose owner had covered the cage with a hood to make the bird quiet. I found myself immediately falling asleep without any electronic distractions. Unfortunately, the night noises kept waking me up just as I would drift off. I heard the crashing through the leaves that had scared me earlier in the day and started to suspect that it was a quick, smaller creature rather than a man-sized zombie. However, until I knew exactly what caused that ruckus, it still scared me to the core. I guess it's the primitive fear of the unknown. The little bouts of noise and waking carried on annoyingly, but also harmlessly. However, 3 hours after sunset, I heard something that sent pure, unabated terror to my heart. I had just drifted back to sleep. Jennifer entered my mind. I can't remember what she said in my sleepy state, but I remember her radiant smile. I knew I was dreaming, but I felt like I was in my own bed. She soon began to morph, and I could feel a foreign influence in my dream. I watched as Jennifer turned into the vampiress that was on the footage and had haunted my earlier dreams. She seemed to be trying to warn me about something, but I just couldn't quite hear or understand her. For some reason, I wasn't scared until I heard the crunch of leaves from the placing of a single large foot. The footsteps were not part of my dream. I was instantly awake. The sound wasn't scurrying or crashing through the leaves that I had been hearing all day. Instead, it was a cold, calculated single footstep in the leaves, followed by a pause and another single footstep. It was definitely human, or something that once was. It had to be something at least as large as me. It was the exact same sound of my footsteps when I was trying to walk silently on the leaves, maybe heavier. I could feel cold sweat instantly beating all over my skin as each slow, stalking step unmistakably sounded like it was getting closer. It stopped 10 feet from my tent, and I could hear it grunting as it rustled through something. I sat up quietly, holding my breath. I grabbed and opened my inadequate knife and picked up my headlamp without turning it on. I unzipped a small portion of the tent flap, flicked on the flat headlamp, and shone the light in the direction of the noise. I groaned as I turned off the headlamp and zipped up the flap. It was a bear, with its hind end towards me. I caught my breath and unzipped the flap again. I aimed my light on him again. It had to weigh at least twice as much as me. Damn, I swore under my breath. The bastard had literally ripped open the fabric of my backpack with its razor-honed claws and was ransacking my food. The bear did it with such smugness that didn't even react to me shining a light on it. The thing was treating my food and my pack like it owned it. I zipped the flap back up. The slight fabric of the tent felt as inadequate as my small knife, but I had something else for such an encounter. I felt around for the bear spray. Besides my multi-tool, bear spray was my only weapon. I found it and aimed it in the direction of the bear, double-checking to make sure the nozzle wasn't pointing at me. I unzipped the flap, hesitated, and sprayed directly at the bear. I instantly fell back, coughing in total agony. My eyes stung. I couldn't breathe. It felt like I inhaled the angry inhabitants of a hornet's nest. Despite not being able to breathe, I somehow managed to curse enough to make a sergeant in the Marine Corps blush. It took a few minutes for me to get my reactions under control and be able to see again. I had a string of snot about 3 feet long hanging from my nose. As I wiped my hand across my face, it felt like a jellyfish slapped me. I looked at the flap and realized that I had shot the bear spray straight into the mosquito netting. Looking past the screen, the bear seemed completely oblivious to my plight. He just kept chowing down and scattering clothes, food wrappers, survival gear, camera equipment, and everywhere. I cursed him loudly, but he kept eating, so I ineffectively kept cursing. The bear pawed around some more and grunted. I guess he ran out of food because he finally turned around and confidently walked towards me. My angry curses turned to screams of terror. The bear stopped a few feet from me, within easy lunging distance, and stood up on his hind legs. He looked to be about as tall as that 20-foot-high electric fence. My screams turned to reverential swearing, then to prayers as he prepared to lunge. But instead, he went back to all fours and wrinkled his nose. I saw a stone fly out of nowhere and strike the bear. I tried to convince myself that I didn't see a thrown stone, because I didn't want to consider who or what had thrown the projectile. Besides, the bear seemed to have little interest in me. With a snort and a haughty throw of his snout, the bear casually turned and waddled away. The pepper spray offended the bear's sense of smell. I felt a bit of shame that my greatest method of self-defense was simply that the animal saw me as grotesquely inedible. Once I felt sure that it was gone, I exited the tent that felt like the inside of a ghost pepper. I enjoyed the feel of the cold air against my stinging skin. I poured some bottled water over my face. I breathed in the air like drinking water from a cold spring and breathed out feeling relaxed. I suddenly looked over my shoulder and caught my breath. I could have sworn that I saw a figure of a hooded, black-cloaked being staring at me. I blinked, and it stepped back into the gloom. But it was so faint to begin with that I doubted my sanity. Despite the billowing cloak, I was sure it was a willowy, feminine form beneath. I thought of the vampiress. I told myself that the bear spray had given me a nudge towards hallucinations, as I quickly scurried back into the tent. I sat down into my sleeping bag and fell back into my pillow. I painfully tried to sleep after an hour with no further sign of the bear. It started to drizzle and then to rain pretty hard. When I saw there were no leaks in the tent, I relaxed. The rain had a calming effect on my nerves. I figured the bears and anything else would go back to their caves, dens, and lairs. Besides, I enjoyed how the rain would drown out the sound of anything walking in the woods. As silly as it sounds, I liked that because my nerves were frayed, and even though most of what I had heard was really nothing dangerous, the sound from the unknown creature scared me. Also at this point, between the long day, constant terror, and lack of sleep from the last 2 nights, I really didn't care anymore. I just wanted oblivious repose. I finally felt as if I was sinking into sleep. I dreamed I was sinking, then falling down into a black oblivion. I could feel the ground moving beneath me. My eyes widened as I realized I wasn't sleeping or dreaming. I was actually sliding across the wet leaves. The rain had made the leaves slippery, and my tent had turned into a toboggan as I slid down the hill towards the edge of that cliff with the jagged rocks below. Each time I bounced off a tree or rock, I could swear that I broke a bone. I tried to grab some handhold, whether a branch, rock, or even dirt, but I was rolling helplessly ensconced in the tent and the sleeping bag, and couldn't actually grasp anything but the tent floor. Finally, I crashed face first into a tree and stopped. I scrambled to find the zipper as the tent and I slowly started to slip around the tree toward the cliff's edge. I felt my legs dangle and slide off the abyss of the cliff. "Please, God, no," I pleaded in panic. My hand found my knife. I sliced my way out of my tent as it kept sliding off the cliff. I finally got my hands out of the tent. I hugged the tree that had smashed my nose as my tent, sleeping bag, and everything else plummeted into the darkness below. I listened, but never heard my stuff hit the bottom. I cursed as I realized I lost my flashlight. Shaking with cold and fear, I scrambled back up to the backbone ridge line and collapsed, leaning against the tree trunk, panting, exhausted, and beat up. I felt the rain on my face, and to my list of misery, I added soaking clothes whose damp coldness reached my marrow. I laid down on the spot where I had set up my tent. The leaves were damp, but slightly less so where the tent had set. I got no rest before I sat up and felt around for my backpack to find a better coat, but it seemed that my pack had slid down the cliff with my tent. I curled up under the tree and waited for dawn that seemed as mythical as the fairy godmother.